My dad said it loud enough for the whole garage to hear. He fixes other people's cars for a living. He laughed, that low, dismissive laugh I'd known since I was 12. That's what he does. It was my cousin Derek's graduation party. Backyard. Late June, the kind of evening where the heat sticks to everything. The plastic chairs, the paper plates, the back of your neck. About 40 people standing around with beers and red cups. And my dad had decided, right there next to the cooler, that this was the right moment to explain me to his brother. I was standing 6 feet away. He didn't lower his voice. He never did. I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler, didn't say anything, and walked toward the far end of the yard where my cousin Marcus was talking to a few guys I didn't recognize. I smiled. I nodded. I told myself what I always told myself at these things. It doesn't matter. You know what you've built. You don't need him to know it too. But the thing about moments like that is they don't stay where you put them. They follow you home. They sit on the edge of the bed while you're trying to sleep. And eventually, they make you wonder whether you've been wrong to stay quiet. That was 2 years before the night everything changed. My name is Ryan. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, third of 4 kids. My dad worked in insurance middle management, good enough salary, the kind of job he described at every dinner table as serious work. My older brother went into finance. My older sister married a man who went into finance. My younger sister was still in school when all of this happened, and even she had already started taking business classes because that's what my dad suggested, and she had always been better than the rest of us at not making waves. I became a mechanic, not because I fell into it, not because I couldn't do anything else. I became a mechanic because at 16 I pulled apart a 1987 Chevy pickup that my uncle left rusting in a field, and when I put it back together and it started, I felt something that no classroom had ever made me feel. I felt like I understood something. Like I had a conversation with something real and it talked back. My dad's response when I told him I wanted to go to vocational school instead of a 4-year college was exactly what you would expect. He sat back in his chair. He looked at my mother. He looked at the ceiling. Then he said, "Well, it's your life to waste." He said it like he was being kind. I went to biotech. I graduated. I worked at a shop in Broken Arrow for 3 years. Learned everything I could from the owner. A man named Gerald who had grease under his fingernails, and a mind like a calculator, and zero tolerance for shortcuts. Gerald taught me that the difference between a good mechanic and a great one isn't speed or strength, it's honesty. You tell the customer exactly what's wrong and exactly what it will cost, and you never invent a problem to pad a bill. That philosophy became the foundation of everything I did afterward. At 26, I opened my own shop. 1 bay, rented space. A used lift that cost me $4,000 and broke down twice in the first month. I called it Clearline Auto. The name came from a term in brake systems. The clear line is the unobstructed path that lets the fluid do what it's supposed to do. I liked the idea. Clean, direct, honest. My family's reaction ranged from silence to mild concern. My dad asked how much I'd borrowed and from whom. When I told him I'd saved it myself over 3 years, he nodded slowly. The way he nodded when he thought something was a mistake but didn't want to argue. My mother said she hoped it worked out. My brother didn't ask at all. What happened over the next 4 years is the part that sounds like I'm making it up. But every number I'm about to tell you is real. By year 2, I had 3 bays and 4 employees. I had built a reputation in the Tulsa Metro for being the shop that didn't lie to you, that didn't tell a woman her rotors were shot when they weren't, that didn't upsell synthetic oil to a guy with a 2003 Civic who didn't need it. Word spread. Yelp reviews started stacking up. Local news did a small segment on us called The Shop That Won't Take Advantage of You. I framed it and hung it in the break room as a joke, but also not as a joke. By year 3, I'd opened the second location. This one in South Tulsa. Bigger, 8 bays. I hired her manager, a woman named Patricia, who had run operations for a regional chain and left because they kept asking her to look the other way on billing practices. She and I understood each other immediately. By year 4, I had 5 locations across northeastern Oklahoma and had just signed the lease on a 6th in the Kansas City metro. I was 29 years old and I had 38 people on payroll. The company was valued according to a preliminary assessment the previous spring at somewhere between $4 and $5 million. My dad still introduced me as my son who works on cars. Not sarcastically exactly, just accurately in his mind. He knew I had shops. He'd visited one once, early on, walked around, looked at the equipment, said the parking lot could use repaving, and left. After that, his mental model of what I did didn't seem to update. I was still the kid who chose the wrong path. The shops were a version of me getting lucky, not getting good. My mother was warmer about it, in her way. She asked about business sometimes, though always carefully, like she was checking whether a wound had healed. She'd say, "How are the shops doing?" with a kind of cautious optimism, and when I said good, she'd say good, and change the subject. I understood later that she was navigating the distance between what she felt, which I think was genuine pride, and what she could say in front of my father, which was limited. I didn't push it. I had learned early that some battles in that house went nowhere. My brother was the version of this I found hardest to take. Not because he was openly hostile. He wasn't. He was simply absent. Interested in himself, his bonus structure, his golf game, his wife's fundraising events. When we were at family gatherings, he talked at me the way you talk at a TV that might or might not be on. One Thanksgiving he said, "Still doing the car thing?" And I said yes, and he said, "Cool," and walked toward the food table, and that was our entire relationship that year. My dad's brother, my Uncle Paul, was different. Paul had worked construction most of his life, built things with his hands, understood what it meant to be tired in a specific way, that office work doesn't make you tired. He came by one of my shops twice, looked around seriously, asked real questions about margins and employee retention and growth plans. Both times he left, he shook my hand and said, "You're doing something real, Ryan." Paul was the only person in my family who knew what I had built, which made it matter a lot that it was Paul's son, my cousin Derek, getting married that September. The wedding was at a venue outside of Owasso, one of those converted ranch properties with string lights and a gravel path and a barn that had been sandblasted and refinished to look rustic without being rustic. About 120 guests, open bar, which I would later think was either perfect timing or very bad timing depending on who you were. I drove up alone. I had been seeing someone, a woman named Claire who worked in hospital administration, smart and warm and completely unimpressed by any of it in the best possible way. But we had only been together 4 months and a family wedding felt like the wrong context for an introduction. I told her about my family in the careful way you tell someone about a thing you've made peace with but not fully. "Will it be bad?" she asked. "It'll be fine," I said, which was true and also not true. I got there about 40 minutes before the ceremony, found my seat, round table near the back, family section, between my mother and an aunt I hadn't seen in 3 years. My dad was already at the table, jacket buttoned, glass of water in front of him, talking to my aunt about property values in the neighborhood he'd moved to 6 months earlier. He nodded when I sat down. Not warmly, not coldly. The nod you give someone when you've already categorized them, and the category hasn't changed. "Ryan. Dad." That was it. That was the greeting. The ceremony was beautiful, actually. Derek and his fiancée, a woman named Alicia, who I'd met twice and liked both times, said vows they had written themselves that were specific and funny and real. My Uncle Paul stood up at the front in a dark suit and cried in that open, unashamed way that big men sometimes cry at things that matter. And watching him, I felt a warmth I hadn't expected to feel that day. Then the reception started, and the seating arrangement revealed itself. My table at the reception included my parents, my brother and his wife, and 2 other couples I didn't know well, friends of my uncle and aunt. Across the table from me was a man named Garrett, mid-50s, broad shoulders, the specific kind of casual confidence that comes from decades of knowing exactly what you're worth. His wife seated beside him was small and laughed easily at everything he said. My brother's wife introduced herself to Garrett's table the way she always did at gatherings, efficiently establishing who was who and what they did. My brother shook Garrett's hand and mentioned his firm. My dad smiled his company smile and said something about the insurance sector. Garrett listened politely. When introductions reached me, and I said my name, Garrett tilted his head slightly. "Ryan what?" "Ryan Mercer." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not dramatic, just a small recalibration. The look of someone cross-referencing something. "You from Tulsa?" "Born and raised," I said. He nodded slowly, set his glass down. "What do you do, Ryan?" Before I could answer, my dad said it. Not with contempt, exactly. With that particular brand of paternal summary that's worse than contempt, because it isn't even trying to diminish you. It just does. He runs a car shop, my dad said and smiled at Garrett. Few of them, actually. He's always been good with his hands. The way he said hands contained its own small universe of implication. Garrett looked at me for a moment longer than the conversation required. Clearline, he said. The table didn't go quiet. It wasn't that dramatic. But I heard everything around me as if through a slight delay. That's right, I said. Garrett sat back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. Not a laugh, something quieter than that. The exhale of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected. Clearline Auto, he said again, apparently to himself. You've heard of it? My brother said, slightly amused, the way you're amused when a punchline doesn't land the way you expected. Garrett looked at my dad, then at my brother, then back at me, and his expression carried something I can only describe as a kind of careful respect, the look of a man who is choosing his words. I've done more than hear of it, he said. We've been trying to acquire Clearline for the better part of a year. The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. In a room with 120 people, plates being set down, a band tuning near the stage. It wasn't a silence anyone outside our table would have noticed, but at our table, it was a specific kind of quiet. I watched my dad's face process the sentence. You could see it happen. The word acquire landing. The implication unwrapping itself. Garrett turned to me with the directness of someone who spent his career in rooms where clarity mattered. You're the founder, he said. It wasn't a question. I am. And you built it from the single location in Broken Arrow. Tulsa, originally, I said. The second was Broken Arrow. He nodded. Then he did something I didn't expect. He stood up, extended his hand across the table, and shook mine, firmly, with both hands, the handshake that means something. I owe you an apology, actually, he said. We sent an offer letter in April that was, our team told me, probably insulting. I should have been in the room for that conversation. It was low, I agreed. He smiled. It was embarrassing. We knew it. He sat back down. I told them to go back with something real. Did you receive the revised terms? My attorney did, I said. We haven't responded yet. My brother made a sound, not a word. A sound. The kind a person makes when a room rearranges itself and they're not sure where to stand. My dad said nothing. He had picked up his water glass and was looking at it with the concentration of a man reading something complicated. Garrett's wife leaned forward. Wait, this is the shop group that was in Forbes? The one with the transparency model? Regional business section, I said. 2 months ago. I showed that to my son, she said. He's thinking about opening a restaurant, and I said, this is how you run something. The fact that they post their markup rates publicly, I said, this is either insane or genius. Little of both, I said. She laughed. My mother, seated to my right, made a small sound that might have been a breath or might have been the beginning of something she decided not to say. I didn't look at her. I was looking at Garrett because Garrett was the only person at the table who had known me for 8 minutes and was treating me like a full version of myself, and that felt like something I wanted to stay close to. My dad put his glass down. He cleared his throat. I didn't realize, he said, that it had gotten that it was that size. It was the closest he had come to saying something real in 20 years of family dinners. I know, I said, not unkindly, but not softly either. Garrett and I talked for most of the cocktail hour, drifting away from the table toward the edge of the venue where the string lights ended and the actual evening sky started. He ran a regional automotive services group out of Dallas, 14 locations, mostly Texas and Oklahoma, with ambitions to go broader. He had seen something in Clearline's model that he said his own operations team had been trying to crack for years. You turned the honesty into the marketing, he said. Most operators see transparency as a liability. You made it the product. It was always just how I wanted to run it, I said. That's what makes it work. You can't perform that. Customers feel the difference. We talked about the acquisition interest straightforwardly, the way two people can talk when there's no performance required on either side. I told him where I was in my thinking, which was genuinely undecided. I had built Clearline to be something, and selling meant a question about what came after. He said he understood that, and that whatever I decided, the conversation had been worth having. At some point, my Uncle Paul appeared beside me, glass of bourbon in hand, and shook Garrett's hand with the warmth he gave everyone, and then looked at me and said, "You doing all right?" "Better than expected," I said. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment. "Brief?" the way men of his generation make contact, and then moved on. It was the simplest thing. It was one of the best things that happened to me that night. Later, during dinner, the table had reorganized itself emotionally, even though no one had moved chairs. My brother asked Garrett about the acquisition landscape in the automotive sector, and Garrett answered generously. And I noticed that my brother asked the questions the way he asks questions when he's recalibrating, gathering information after the ground has shifted. His wife asked me something for the first time in a long time, a real question. When did you start thinking about expansion? Was there a specific moment? I told her about the second location, the decision that had felt enormous at the time. She listened, actually listened, and said, "That took guts. Going from 1 to 2 is harder than 2 to 5, I think. That first one is the hardest bet." She was right, and I told her so. My dad ate quietly. He spoke when spoken to. He was not cruel or cold. He was diminished in a way that had nothing to do with anything I had done to him, only with the distance between the story he had told himself and the room he was sitting in. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I had spent years telling myself that the moment he understood what I'd built, I would feel something clear and complete, some settling of an old account. But what I actually felt was more complicated and smaller, something closer to tired, like a weight I had carried so long that putting it down didn't feel like relief so much as a kind of unfamiliar lightness I wasn't sure what to do with. After the main course, I stepped outside through a side door, onto a stone patio that looked out over a dark field. The music was muffled out here. I could see a few other guests who had stepped out for air. I stood there for a while with my jacket on, looking at the sky, thinking about a conversation I needed to have and was not looking forward to. My dad came out about 10 minutes later. He stood beside me, not close, not far. We both looked at the field. "How long has Garrett's group been after you?" he said. "About a year." He nodded. Quiet for a moment. "You didn't mention it. We don't really talk about the business, Dad." He accepted that. He stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets. I didn't know he was. He paused. "I thought you were doing okay." I didn't understand the scale. I thought about saying I know. I thought about saying that's because you never asked. I thought about 20 years of dinners and the word hands and my cousin's graduation party, and he fixes other people's cars loud enough for the whole yard to hear. What I said was this: I built something that I'm proud of. It would have been nice if you'd been curious about it somewhere along the way, but I built it either way. He didn't respond for a moment. The field was dark and still, and somewhere in the distance there was a sound that might have been wind. I know I wasn't. He stopped. Started again. "I didn't think you were serious about it becoming something." "I know you didn't. I was wrong about that." It was not an apology. It was something less than an apology and more than nothing. I had spent enough time around honest accounting, actual numbers, real costs, true assessments, that I had stopped being comfortable with anything less than accuracy. And this was an accurate statement of a very limited thing. He was wrong about that. Not about how he'd said it or why. Not about the shape of the damage. Just about the fact itself. I said, "Yeah." He went back inside before I did. I stayed out there a while longer. The sky above Oklahoma in September has a specific quality I've always liked. Wide and dark and completely indifferent to everything happening underneath it. Standing under it. The acquisition offer and the dinner table and my dad's face all seemed to belong to a scale that the sky declined to acknowledge. I had 38 people on payroll. I had built something from one bay and a broken lift and a philosophy about honesty that a man I'd never met was willing to travel to Oklahoma to discuss. I didn't need my father to understand it for it to be real. I had always known that. But there's a difference between knowing the thing and feeling it settle into the foundation of you. The way a properly torqued bolt feels different from one that's almost right. Almost right will hold for a while. But you know. That night, driving home on 169 with the radio low, I felt it settle. I called Garrett's office the following Tuesday. His assistant put me through inside of a minute. "I've been thinking about the revised terms," I said. And I want to talk about what a partnership looks like before we talk about an acquisition. I'm not ready to hand it off, but I'm interested in resources and reach if the structure is right." There was a pause on his end that I recognized as the pause of a man who had expected a different kind of negotiation and was reorienting to a better one. "That," he said, "is a more interesting conversation." We scheduled it for 3 weeks out. I told Patricia the same afternoon. She took off her glasses, polished them on her shirt, put them back on, and said, "Took you long enough." I told my Uncle Paul at Derek's post-wedding barbecue 2 weeks later. He set down his tongs, looked at me for a long moment, and then nodded in that serious way. He nodded when something confirmed what he already believed. "You know what your grandfather would have said," he said. "That I should have asked for more," I said. Paul laughed. "He would have said, the ones who told you no are the reason you didn't stop." I thought about that for a while. He was right. Every dinner table assumption, every he fixes other people's cars, every nod that meant wrong path, I had converted all of it without meaning to into fuel. Not anger exactly. Something cleaner than anger. A need to make the thing real so that no one's version of me was the final word on what I was. I don't know that I forgave my dad that night at the wedding. Forgiveness is not a moment. It's a direction, and I was pointed toward it without quite arriving. What I had was something more workable. The understanding that his limits were his, not mine. That I had carried them as though they measured me, and they didn't. The partnership terms were signed 4 months later. Clearline Auto kept its name, its model, its transparency standards. Those were non-negotiable, and Garrett hadn't tried to negotiate them because he understood they were the product. We expanded into Kansas, Missouri, and Colorado over the following 18 months. Patricia was promoted to COO with an equity stake that she would have been a fool to turn down and was smart enough not to. My dad came to the signing, which surprised me. I hadn't expected it and didn't ask for it. My Uncle Paul mentioned it was happening and my dad showed up. He sat in the back of the conference room, jacket on, and watched the attorneys walk through the terms. And when it was done, and Garrett shook my hand, my dad stood up and looked at me across the room with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not pride exactly. Not apology. Something inside means, in the space where those two things meet when they're both too late and not quite worthless. I nodded at him the way he had nodded at me at the wedding. He nodded back. It was not everything, but it was honest. And I had learned a long time ago on a greasy concrete floor in Tulsa that honest was enough to build on.